Well, thank you very much. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm here in Washington, D.C. I wish I were there in person, and I look forward to a return to the UK when the opportunity permits. I thought that I would start out just by speaking a little bit about the desirable properties of the Internet of Things. And there's a list of things that I think are important: safety, security, privacy, uh, scalability, um, let's say autonomy, and related kinds of things. And so let me just start out on the safety and security side. First of all, if the things are not safe, nobody's going to want them in their homes or their offices and so on. So safety is really a very, very high priority, I think, for all of these devices. And on the security side and the privacy side, I think strong authentication is a really important property. The devices themselves need to be strongly authenticable so that a control system that's talking to them can be assured that it's talking to the right device. So that suggests to me digital signatures. But the reverse is also true. Once the devices are configured, they should have a very limited population of things that they're willing to talk to, they're willing to accept commands from, willing to share information with. Again, all in support of privacy and safety and security. On the reliability side, I think this is super important. I mean, you don't want a light switch that works 80% of the time, or a refrigerator that only works 90% of the time. So I think reliability needs to be a very high priority for the design and building of these IoT devices. I mentioned autonomy, and here I'm thinking about the very label Internet of Things suggests that these are connected to the internet and that it's important that they have that capacity. On the other hand, you don't want a house or a building or an industrial plant that suddenly stops working because the internet connection broke. So you need to have autonomous operation, at least some measure of autonomous operation in the absence of internet, even though it might be the case that there are some functions that might not be available, like adding a new device into the collection of devices that are part of the system. Uh, Scaling is a big issue here, and so let me just suggest to you a scenario where you are moving to a new house. The previous owner had 100 IoT devices in the house, and you are bringing another 100 of them. So you have 200 of these devices. Now, the last thing in the world you would want is be sitting there for half the week typing IPv6 addresses in to configure all of these things. So if we're going to design and build IoT equipment, we better think our way through how to configure at scale. And it gets worse, of course, in an industrial setting. You might have 10,000 of these things. So we really need to think about user interfaces that are readily scalable. There is in the background also a really strong requirement, I think, for interoperability across brands of IoT devices. And that's still a struggle. There's more than one, let me call it, standard for communication, and I think we need to encourage all of the producers of those devices, including Google, where I work, to look for interoperability and commonality, partly in aid of safety and security and reliability, but also in order to make them manageable in a reasonable way. That gets to another interesting problem. When you think about the number of devices that you might have of this type, the numbers go up very, very quickly. We did a straw poll at Google, just of a collection of engineers. People were going to figure out, how many devices they actually have, with labeled IP addresses at home. And some of them ranged up to about 40 of them. I'm not quite that many, but I had about 30. And some I'd forgotten about, and they were still functional with batteries in some sock drawer or somewhere. And so, we did a little inventory and said, wow, I'd forgotten about that. So the numbers could get fairly big. And at some point, I used to tell jokes that someday every light bulb will have its own IP address. Well, that's not a joke anymore because they make light bulbs with IP addresses in them, like the Philips Hue, for example. And the reason that's important is that if you think of an internet-enabled house, as a thing which lets you interact with devices in the house, maybe with voice interaction. The question then is, if you say turn on the lights, which light did you mean, especially in a room that might have a lot of lights? In this room alone, I think I have, since I have ceiling lights and everything, I probably have about a dozen lights in the house, in the room. So now, do you have to give them names like Frank and George and Eddie? And that sounds fine, except for the fact that what happens if you have a visitor? You have to give them a list of the names of the lights in every room in the house. So what's the right way to deal with scaling and identification of the devices that you're interacting with? Now, there's some people have some interesting ideas with using a mobile, for example, and being able to figure out where it's pointing. I mean, maybe there's a laser, or maybe there's some other way of identifying that. So you can point at something and then interact with it. This raises another interesting question, though. Families have members, and you don't necessarily want all members to have all authorities for managing the devices in the house. So, the parents probably should have more ability to control the house, especially the safety and security system, the locking of the doors and windows and so on, or the sensors in the system. And the kids shouldn't have quite so much authority. Of course, the problem is that in these technical spaces, the kids probably know more than the adults do, and we won't even go there for now. But imagine for a moment that you need to be able to distinguish who is giving a command. And so, do you use voice recognition? We found that to be not necessarily perfectly feasible or reliable. Then you have the problem of friends that come over. If you have friends over for dinner and you want them to be able to use the facilities, for example, do you have to train the system? You have to get them a microphone and a little list of words that they have to say so that the system can recognize them and who they are. And then what about somebody who stays for a week or two? You clearly want them to be able to live comfortably in the house. But then you don't want them to have control over your house when they leave. So you also have to have an unlearning capability. And now maintenance people come in and out, and they may need to have access to some of the devices, but not all of them. And then there are criminals who wander by, and you don't want the criminal to stand in the front door and say, open the door, and have it open the door. So I'm not sure that the people who make these devices have fully thought through all of those various scenarios, and I'm pretty sure they don't necessarily have a lot of solutions to them. But I draw those to your attention, since people like you are going to have responsibility for making sure some of these properties are satisfied. Let me also suggest to you that some of these devices are likely to have long lifetimes. So heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, for example, go on for perhaps 10, 15, 20 years. And if they're software driven, one of the big issues is updating the software to fix bugs, for example, or to add new functionality. And here, again, it's very important that the device be able to know where is the software coming from. Has it been altered on its trip from the source to the destination? So hashing and digital signatures are, once again, our friend here in order for a device to accept a new download and make sure that it's getting up-to-date software. So with an eye on time, I think maybe I'll stop with that conversation and see whether we have questions. If we don't have any questions, I guarantee you that you can wind me up and I'll just keep going like an old Stanford professor, which I am, as a matter of fact. That was a long time ago. So I have the chat here also, if that's helpful.
Yes.
It looks like I have one question already.
Yep.
So this is a very funny question, actually. My old light bulbs didn't need security updates. My new ones do. My old TV didn't need security update. My new one does. Do you think consumers understand the need to maintain their smart devices? No, I don't. I think that and the more we make the old devices look like, the new devices look like the old ones, they'll inherit whatever the properties were that, at least in the minds of the consumers. So it's actually a really good question. By the way, this probably translates into new work. And so, people talk about jobs going away because of technology. Well, new jobs will come along, one of which is somebody to come and configure my house for me, please. And now we get into, of course, trustworthy questions like, what if they configured the house and included themselves in as a position with a position of authority, which they could then sell to other people on the market, like stolen credit cards. So somebody else can rob your house. I think that there are some really complex policy issues here, as well as technology issues that we need to think our way through. Yeah, if we don't want to end up being vilified for having, created these devices and put them into the hands of people that we shouldn't trust. So thank you. That's a really good question, and I hope all of us are, with our computer science hats on, giving some serious thought to how to assure that we have the safety of the population in mind. So here is another question, a repeat of my question this morning. Well, Julian, I wasn't there this morning, so this is a new one for me. What do you think about the impact of technology churn on the environment? Oh, Lordy, you're so right about that. The ongoing desire for the latest and greatest. It reminds me of the story I was told that in Japan, mobiles are very popular. And the thing you do when you sit down to lunch with a friend is to take out your mobile, put it on the table, just to show which one you have, to show off that you have the most recent one. I mean, for example, I have a Pixel 5 here in case anybody cares. I worry about that too. And I worry about the idea that we should really try to slow the pace down if we can. Let me give you an example of a place where it actually seems to work fairly well. My wife and I ended up buying Teslas because she was concerned about the environment and wanted an electric car. And the thing I noticed is that it's basically a computer and a battery on wheels. And it gets new capabilities by changing the software. So you get into the car and it says, guess what I can do today that I couldn't do yesterday? Of course, my first response to that is, please assure me you can still do the stuff that I was relying on yesterday in addition to anything new. But your point's well taken, and it may very well be that this software regime allows us to maintain the same physical equipment over a longer period of time and simply change its functionality with new software. Again, that's not a panacea, but it's at least one path for improvement. Leroy mentions John McAfee, who sadly appears to have committed suicide in jail. Why have developers not created applications which are more secure and robust? Several reasons, one of which is cost. An example of IoT, especially, that worries me is that you're going to create this thing, you're going to sell it for 38 pounds, and you don't want to spend a lot of time on the operating system. So you go to GitHub and you grab anything you can find that will do, and you throw it in, sell it, end of story, got your money, don't need to deal with this anymore. That is absolutely not an acceptable practice, but it sadly is the practice in many cases. Leroy asks if open source is causing the problem. No, I don't think it's exactly causing it, but it is contributing to it because open source is free and people take advantage of that. So we have to rely on people like yourselves to be disciplined and ethical about your use of technology. And that's something we need to reinforce and probably create incentives to produce the behavior that we want. Let's see, Andy says, at home, I can control what devices connect on the internet and inspect the traffic they create. How concerned are you about 5G taking control of connectivity? Oh, I worry about that a lot. I worry about 5G for a whole lot of different reasons, not the least of which is slicing, which I think is an offense because it slices up the capacity instead of taking broadband packet switching and using that effectively. So I am worried about wireless in general being a potential hazard unless it's adequately secured. Paul says younger family members can't give informed consent to data collection. How do we balance this privacy concern? Well, probably by somehow figuring out if you can inhibit that collection. I'm not sure how to do that. I mean, your point's extremely well taken. So maybe it has something to do with the way in which it gets configured. This gets pretty complicated if you think about how the software has to work. It has to distinguish parties that for whom data should not be collected and parties that should be, and that gets us back to the problem of identification. I'm keeping an eye on time. I see it's the half hour has arrived. Can we keep going for a little bit?
Yeah, we've got about another 5 minutes, Vint, if that's okay. Got a lot of interesting questions there.
Yes, I hoped as much. So Howard asks, do you think that the world is generally becoming too complex and we have an opportunity to expend efforts to simplify things? So the answer is yes, I agree with that. I think, in fact, we are creating a very fragile, brittle kind of future. The more we depend on technology, the more risky it is, and the more propagation effects occur when things don't work. A good example is what happened recently in the United States when the Colonial Pipeline was held up for ransom. And they shut down their operation because the encrypted information apparently was needed for the SCADA system. So they didn't attack the SCADA directly, but they attacked the things that were non-SCADA that the SCADA relied on. So they shut the system down. And the result was for several days, gasoline dried up and there were cars that were, stuck or couldn't go anywhere. It was hugely disruptive. And if you think about how dependent we are on this chain of technology and services and products, I do worry a lot about that. I don't know that we're going to be able to help, though. You could try for simplification, but I think it's almost like the second law of thermodynamics. I think things get more complicated as time goes on. But we should try. We should try. Anonymous says, how do you think historians will look back on this period of time when the book is written? Will it be a happy read? It'll be a mixed bag. The spectacular capacity to go make vaccines in a year, I thought, was just frankly extraordinary. And we owe a lot to internet and to sharing of information and extraordinary capacity to do processing and analysis, DNA sequencing and the like. So that's just one concrete example of extraordinary power that these technologies have brought. Think about machine learning and some of the other applications. But at the same time, think about machine learning and some of the other applications where they get it wrong, and we don't know ahead of time that it's going to do that, or we can't predict ahead of time that something is brittle or unreliable. So I think history will look back at us and see that we struggled with these technologies and the fact that they could be abused and are being abused and were abused. And the real question will be, what did we do about that? Were we able to contain the harmful behaviors that these technologies support? And I think that if we look back in time, we will see similar kinds of problems arising. I mean, for all I know, the invention of the long bow might have introduced a gigantic twist in history, because suddenly you could attack the guy with the short bow or a lance from farther away than his attack radius was, and that probably changed the equation all over the place. So I don't have enough, perspective to say how we will be received, but I think it will be a mixed bag. Julian says, one view is that the current ransomware attacks are payback time, paying us for all the security-related things we should have been doing anyway. Well, it certainly feels that way, doesn't it, Julian? I'm not sure it's directed precisely at us, but we should feel as if it were, because I feel like we should feel responsible for having not produced more secure systems. Tim says, given the amount of devices manufactured in various foreign countries, how can anyone guarantee they only do what they're supposed to do? They can't. And this raises a really interesting question about being able to look at source code and ask, what does it do and what does it not do, and what can I say about that? That suggests that we should be thinking about programming regimes where some strong things could be said. I'm not talking about necessarily proof of correctness, but are there invariants that we can assure ourselves imply that the system is working correctly and not doing things that it's not supposed to do? It's a really hard problem. Think about a refrigerator that gets attacked. It's running a Linux or something, and it's doing everything it's supposed to do, but it's also sending out spam and doing a bunch of other things. And as long as our ice cream is cold, we don't notice, that the refrigerator is doing some bad thing. The result being that harm occurs, and we don't know that. So it's a tough problem. Does digital sovereignty matter? It sure does. I don't, he says, this is Adam. Is it possible? Well, not entirely, but people are going to try. It's a terrible idea. The reason it's terrible is that it wrecks your ability to build data centers scattered all over the place that are trading information back and forth to make sure that nobody loses anything. So our data centers do that. We built a fairly significant optical backbone network to make sure we can replicate data so the loss of a data center anywhere doesn't lose any data. And yet, if people insist on data sovereignty and prevent that kind of data transfer from happening, then you can't build a reliable system. So I consider that to be a real problem. What we are over time now, so maybe I should stop there. Mark, Chris, Leroy, and Chris Wilson and Chris Adams. If you can save those questions and send them to me, I'll try to answer them by email if that's okay.